There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean Breathes Books. Welcome back to my channel, and I'm here with one of the loveliest long-term supporters of my channel and patron, Robin, joining us from California. Hello, Robin.
Hi, Sean. How are you doing? I'm happy to be here.
I'm excited about our chat. We're talking
Yeah.
about a book that we have it's kind of a pseudo buddy read type of chat about Barbara Pym's fourth novel, Less Than Angel.
I have the
Less Than
same
Angels, which
edition.
is,
Yes.
yeah, this is the latest one from Virago. This is a reread for me, and I think this was your first time reading it. And now, without having discussed it at all up until this point, we're going to share our thoughts and feelings and insights thereupon. We're going to start out talking about Less Than Angels in a spoiler-free way, but we do want to talk about stuff that happens at the end. So just to let you know that you will be amply warned when we're going to move into spoiler territory, and then you can make your own decisions at that time. But until I explicitly say that we're about to move into spoiler territory, you can sit back, relax, and we won't spoil a darn thing for you. Robin, give us your general reaction to the book.
Well, I'm just so excited to be reading Pym in general for the first time. So thank you for introducing me to her. This is my fourth one. I'm reading them chronologically, but each subsequent book, I'm just like, oh my gosh, she's wonderful. Why have I not read her before? And I'm ready to go on to the next one. And the same with this one. And I am always worried that, oh, am I going to be let down a little bit on the next one? But I actually, this one was very fascinating to me, and I really enjoyed it. Her sense of humor and her writing, I really love it. I think I underlined so many little passages throughout the book because they were either so funny or poignant remarks. And so I loved it.
Yes, that's great. Me too. This, as I said, this was my second read of it, and when I read it the first time, goodness, maybe about 7 years ago, it didn't hit me quite as much as the first three, or the first two, I would say. This opened her debut, Some Tame Gazelle, which it wasn't quite a buddy read, but it was kind of like a buddy read that Robin and I did last year. I think is my favorite of hers still. That was 1950, and her second one, Excellent Women, 1952, which is most people's favorite. It's not my favorite, but it's excellent. It's an excellent novel. Jane and Prudence, 1953, which I don't remember very well. That one hasn't stuck on my memory. And then Less Than Angels, 1955. And I wasn't sure that it was as engaging when I read it the first time, but there was something about the protagonist, Catherine's journey, especially at the end, where she just kind of ignited. She just kind of burst not into flame, but just into being in a way that was quite rebellious, defiant, and I was absolutely riveted by her at the end of the novel. And that was basically the same too, although I now realize on a second reading how subtle that trajectory was portrayed, so that some readers might not agree with me that it was so as pronounced as it felt to me, but I thought it was really quite a deft characterization of a single woman in post-war Britain in a way that really resonated with Barbara Pym's own life and loves and loneliness and opportunities as being a single woman. So I was really glad to have reread it and enjoyed it, I would say, even more. Another 5-star read from Barbara Pym.
What stood out about this one for me versus the other three, which I also loved, was like you, what I feel is the central character of Catherine. I don't think there was a central character as strong as that in the first three of her novels. And so I think that is what really stuck out to me with this novel was that character of Catherine. And I found her really fascinating and enjoyed seeing the development of her character and the relationship she had with the other characters throughout the novel. So that I think it was really Catherine that stuck out to me.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that on my rereading of Less Than Angels, I could see how Catherine was really quite central from the beginning in a way that I didn't catch upon my first reading.
Felt like she even though you do see her growth as a character and as a person through the novel, I felt like from the beginning she was very modern and forward thinking. The fact that she's living with Tom right at the get-go, and they're very open about that relationship, and she's not concerned with what other people think. She's very much her own person as well. So she's not an anthropologist. She does not want to read his dissertation. I mean, she might help him with it, but she's got her own writing and her own interests. She likes to read wine lists, which were probably not very interesting to Tom or anyone else, maybe. But I think from the get-go, I felt like she was a well-rounded person who was really searching to become that type of a woman in that post World War II era of Britain.
Absolutely. And she is a freelance writer. She writes articles. Some of them are really cheesy or sentimental, but some of them maybe less so, for a variety of magazines. And so she's living independently. And she also doesn't have any family. I don't know if that's ever explained. If it was explained, I have forgotten, but she's an orphan, basically. I mean, what would you say? She's about 30?
Yeah, I
Or
would think
thereabouts?
right about 30.
Yeah.
I think it's briefly mentioned that she's an orphan, right?
Yeah,
And she doesn't come from, I don't think her parents were from a background of wealth either.
that's
Uh,
right.
yeah. So, yeah,
And she meets Tom. Wasn't she wasn't it going across the channel?
I think so. I think
Yeah,
she,
I don't know, to France or somewhere, and she picked him up, or he picked her up, and he ended up staying with her instead of finding his own hotel.
that's right.
Um, what I had kind of glossed over in list, I did this on audio almost exclusively, and there's a really awful version of the audiobook. We won't mention that audio narrator by name, but the one that I thought was excellent, that I listened to it narrated by, is Patience Tomlinson. So I'd occasionally follow along with the text, but mostly just listen to it. So I missed the details that Tom didn't ever really live with Catherine full time. Like, he was kind of going back and forth between various locations, but when he was in London, he would stay with her.
He was gone for like a 2-year period, it seemed, on his field work.
That's right.
And
So that's right. We should say a little bit more about Tom. He is an anthropologist. He's just coming to the end of his studies.
mhm.
And as you said, absolutely, he has been over to Africa for field work, and that's forming a big part of his dissertation or whatever. And he is one of many anthropologists populating the novel. And Catherine is, you've already said it very well, she's separate from that world, but she seems to have a lot of anthropologists around her. Lots of readers don't care about what's true or what it comes from the author's own life, but I'm always curious about it. And in the case of Barbara Pym, her life was surrounded by anthropologists. She worked for decades, I think at least 20 years, it might have been longer, at the International Africa Institute in London, which was an anthropological institute that was sponsoring or whatever anthropologists to go over to Africa and do the research and get it published. And she ended up becoming the editor of their journal. And so she was deep into the world of anthropologists and does a really fun, entertaining send up of them here. And Catherine herself is, like you say, not interested in anthropology particularly. And she makes several cogent observations and draws some interesting comparisons between her kind of writing and academic writing or anthropological, what anthropologists do and what writers do. And we'll probably get into some of that later in the chat. I thought there was just so many nuances to Catherine's character, and without getting into anything spoilery, that progresses to the end where I can see more and more of Barbara Pym in her, to the point where she betrays some fabulous, eccentric eruptions that just kind of disconcert people around her. And with every one of those, she became more interesting to me, and I could see how much of a stand-in she was for Barbara Pym herself. So yeah, a really, really fascinating character. What did you think of Tom?
Well, Tom, Where to begin? I mean, I thought the description of him, I could completely understand his personality and that he was very good looking, very charismatic person. So women were drawn to him and he enjoyed taking advantage of that many times. When he was in Britain, he kind of just used people, in my opinion, somewhat for, in terms of Catherine, a place to stay. She basically took care of him and his needs, and she made her own money. He didn't have to worry about that. But he also did crave romance. That's why he ends up, I think, getting involved with Deirdre. Was that her name? The 19-year-old young woman?
I would say Deirdre, but I think both pronunciations are totally valid. Yeah, Deirdre or Deirdre. Yep.
Because he had come to think of Catherine almost, it was like the romance had left their relationship in a way. I mean, they had become on some levels friends, but not, I don't think it was an equal friendship. But Tom was definitely a free spirit. I don't think he wanted to get married probably ever. I think he enjoyed his life of playing the field. That's kind of a pun, right? He's playing the field at home
In
and
the anthropological field.
so,
And the only thing I would take issue with, the only thing I would disagree with, you called him a free spirit. And I would say he didn't have any spirit. He was just so dull and flat and just a bumbling oaf. He was a typical quintessential Barbara Pym male character. He had no understanding of himself. Yeah. The emotions that would come up in him, he didn't know how to communicate them. And you're absolutely right. So he wanted more romance, but then he would run the other way from that. And that's what kind of sent him back to Africa. It's not a spoiler to say that he does go back to Africa. Anything else about his fate, we're going to put behind the spoiler wall. He's not a villain.
No.
He's not evil. He doesn't abuse anybody, but he's a tip. My understanding of how Barbara Pym viewed, or at least wrote about, British men, just kind of a lot of unquestioned expectations that are very sexist, not much self-awareness, and just a chauvinist way of bumbling through life. And he was quintessentially that way, I thought. Very well drawn.
I like the word bumbling. Yeah, to describe.
Bumbling, absolutely. Yeah. And all of the men in Barbara Pym, they just bumble along.
Yeah, I love her characterizations of them. Quite comic, yeah.
So getting back to anthropology, and anthropology is kind of a stand-in for academia or scholarship versus kind of a more creative life. There are some interesting quotes, and let's see if I can pull one out here. When she and Deirdre and some other people go to the airport to see Tom off when he flies to Africa, she doesn't say this to him, but she thinks to herself about him going back into the field to do his research and leaving not just her, but another woman behind. In fact, 3, if you really, want to put it that way. And how much more comfortable it sometimes was to observe it from a distance, it being life, to look down from an upper window, as it were, as the anthropologists did. So there is something very much about kind of a detachment from the life of the heart and a more visceral experience of life, and instead burying your head in a book or in a bunch of research that will perhaps turn into a book that nobody will ever read.
And that especially made me laugh because my late husband thought he wanted to be an academic and did do a PhD and then realized he did not want to be an academic. But he used to just tell students when he became a librarian who were trying to get their dissertation done, he said, just finish it. Just finish it. Nobody's going to ever read it. And he was right. I mean, it's not that interesting to most people. So I think she really captured that academic life and just the humor that's there that maybe the people that are within it don't realize, but from an outside perspective looking in, she really understood, I felt, that world. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And then the other thing that I think that she does really artfully is she has her characters, but also she herself as the writer looks at British society in this era the way an anthropologist would study
Oh, right.
a foreign thing. So she
Mhm.
has, in the voice of some of her characters, there's commentary and observations, but it's on a deeper layer that she's doing that. That was genius. I love that.
I did too. I thought that she did that so well, where it was actually like she was an anthropologist in the background looking at this British society in depth in a way that she couldn't do on the African continent, but she really zeroed in on all the characters. And I felt like it was like an anthropological study of them.
Absolutely, but even better than that because it
Right.
was a novelist doing it, not
Yeah,
a
exactly.
fusty old, dusty old
Right.
academic. Absolutely,
She was saying, this is how it really should be done.
that's right. And that was based on, like I say, decades of being in their midst and editing their papers and all of that. I think that it would be it would be a disservice to people watching this video to not address the fact that there's a lot of racialized, I would say racist stereotypes in this. I think ultimately there is a moment where she bats down a really racist comment at the end of the novel. We're about to move into spoiler territory, but talking about it in a non-spoiler way, where she doesn't go there herself, but she puts it in the mouth of one of her characters and kind of resists it in the narrative, which I appreciated and I had missed the first time. But there are racist observations that Barbara Pym puts in the mouths of many of her characters in many of her novels. That is part of who she was. I'll just leave that there, and you can do lots of biographical research. How racist was she? Blah, blah, blah. But certainly there are comments, there are a lot of opinions that don't stand the test of time from this 1955 novel.
I would totally agree with that. You're right. And definitely a commentary, not that she was making a commentary, but just reading it now, the colonialism that Great Britain was involved with on the continent of Africa really comes through strongly. Reading it, from this perspective, as well as the racism. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's a good place, I think, to segue into some spoiler territory. So, people, I told you I'd warn you. I am now warning you that we're going to talk about stuff that happens at the end of the book. If you don't want to hear about anything that happens at the end of the book, here's what I suggest you do. Push stop on the video and rush out to your library, bookstore, or Kindle, or whatever you need to do. Scribd, however you can get your hands on the novel, read it, and then come back. So let's continue the discussion about racism and colonialism now that we're on the other side of that spoiler wall, because the moment that I was talking about obliquely, Tom is killed when he goes back to Africa. I believe it's Deirdre's aunt, Rhoda, who says when she learns the news, oh, did the natives kill him? And in fact, it wasn't the natives. It wasn't indigenous Africans who killed him. I don't think the country in Africa is ever identified. If it was, I missed it. I think
Which
it's
is
just Africa, which is
right.
another right thing.
You're right.
Another we could talk about that. But Rhoda, if I'm remembering that it's Rhoda, it's either Rhoda or Mabel, her widowed sister, says, "Oh, it must have been she was killed by the natives." And Catherine, who's bringing this tragic news, says, "Oh no, it was the British colonial police. They were putting down an uprising, and Tom got in the middle of it and was shot by our own people." And
Mhm.
I love the fact that Pym did that because she could have so easily gone the other way and put it into that racist thing, but she actually there was a rebuttal to the
Yeah,
presumption of that, and I appreciated that.
I did too. I was happy to see that she did that at that point in the novel and pushed back on that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can't think of another moment in any of Barbara Pym, but I'd have to think about it some more, that is as political as that moment, is the fact that Tom is killed by the colonists, the colonial enforcers, police somewhere in Africa. That's about as political as anything I've read in Barbara Pym. So I want to kind of keep that in my mind as I continue to reread her, because she wasn't an overtly political writer, but that is a moment that has a certain vibration to it that I'd like to think about some more. And so Tom is dead, and we see the reaction of Catherine and Deirdre, both of whom he left behind to go to Africa. What did you make of their reactions?
I thought Deirdre's reaction was very interesting because I felt she was already at the point where she'd kind of moved on with
Very much so.
yeah, so she didn't really have the type of emotional reaction because she'd already had a reaction to him leaving. And not knowing when he would return. And so she'd already had a period of time where she really had moved on and she'd gone through all that grief of losing that first love that she'd had with him. And then Catherine, always the one to look out for other people. You know, she came in and she wanted to make sure that Deirdre was okay. But then it was nice to see the aunts, Rhoda and Mabel.
Yeah, Mabel is Deirdre's mother, and Rhoda is the aunt, the spinster aunt.
Right. They in turn took care of Catherine for a change at the end. I think they understood that Catherine was also grieving for Tom.
Absolutely. And all of that was fascinating. Catherine's whole perspective from beginning to end, we don't see the beginning except in kind of a retrospective, but from the time the novel opens until the end of the novel, her perspective on the relationship with Tom was fascinating because she's the one that kind of pushed him out. She caught Tom at a cafe with Deirdre they were holding hands, and she used that kind of almost as an excuse to say, you need your time and space, you should move out. And it wasn't heated, it wasn't you betrayed me, it was just kind of matter of fact. And he didn't really want to move out. But he did move out, so she was kind of feeling a little bit one more independence and not so sure about that this was what she wanted over the longer term. She did have feelings for Tom, but I think they were always complicated by her kind of push-pull about wanting a more independent life. And so her reaction to Tom's death, I thought, was fairly muted as well. Not because she had a new man, although we could talk. We won't probably take the time to talk about Alaric Lydgate, but I wish we had time, but the reader should just discover that for themselves. I will, I think, refer to it in an oblique way in a minute. But through all of this stuff, I think Catherine has just found in a much deeper way herself.
Mm-hmm.
And so she does need that care of Deirdre's family. And within a matter of hours, she's also finding it really quite suffocating. She wants to get home to her messy house and chaotic life or independent life. And that was the part that struck me because there was certain things she would say or subterranean stuff going on for her that just fascinated me. It was a type of fierce independence and autonomy and creativity that she's one of my favorite Pym heroines, I would say.
Yeah, so far mine too. I mean, I felt happy for her at the end. She was her own person. She loved her life and her independence. And regardless if she continued on with Alaric or not, she was going to be completely fine. She had her own life and her own interests and career. Yeah.
Yes, and there is a comment made. It's narrated to us as her inner thought. But when she's thinking about Alaric, and Alaric is a retired colonial administrator and kind of dilettantish anthropologist, but I think he's retired. Like how old is he? He always seemed like an old man to me. But anyway, she was curious about him and interested in him. I don't necessarily think there was a romantic or sexual interest, but I think that's open to interpretation. But very close to the end of the novel, she thinks to herself, yeah, I'm going to keep in touch with this guy, but I'm not going to lose myself in it. I'm paraphrasing it, but that was how I interpreted it. And it was a really powerful moment at the end of the novel, I thought.
Agree. Yeah, she was her own person and she wasn't going to lose herself in a man.
Powerfully feminist ending to a wonderful novel.
Yes, agree. I loved it. I really loved it. The only other scene that I just thought was hilarious is when they burn all of Alaric's notes of how many years. I love that scene.
I agree with you. It was funny, very funny, and we're probably not doing the comedy. We haven't
Yeah.
done the comedy justice in this conversation because there's so many other things to talk about, but it is hilarious in so many places. And that document burning thing, she convinces this retired colonial guy who was also kind of an amateur anthropologist to burn his notes that he kept thinking he'd put together into a book. And that resonates with other moments of burning research or not being confined or constrained by the documents that we surround ourselves with in our lives. That I thought there's an academic paper to be written about that, what that's all about in this novel. But yes, it was quite a moment near the end of the novel, and the people watching it were quite horrified.
Right.
Alaric's sister,
There was a
Mrs.
lot of, and maybe this is the anthropologist thing, but there was a lot of people watching their neighbors in this book, in this novel, where they're kind of seeing what they're up to, looking through their windows, looking at them at night in their
oh,
gardens. And yeah,
oh,
it was really,
absolutely.
yeah.
And without making a long spiel about it, this is a central part of Barbara Pym's life and her writing. Observing others, that's socially appropriate, to be the observer, to have the kind of eye where you see things that other people might not notice. But also, and it isn't in this novel, but it is in some of her later novels to an extreme where it's actually borderline stalking.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that she, yeah, I won't say. I'll leave it as a tease for the reader. You got to keep reading Barbara Pym. It's fascinating, and it mirrors an impulse that got her in a bit of trouble in her own personal life. So
Okay.
so
Thank you for that teaser.
I think the novel where it's explored in the most detail, if memory serves, is No Fond Return of Love.
Okay.
Anyway, Robin, this was such a great chat. Thank you for suggesting that we buddy read this book and do a chat about it. Let's do something else like this again sometime.
Yeah, I'm delighted to. Thank you so much, Shawn. This has been great. I love talking about Barbara Pym or books in general with you.